Hello, I'm Meral Büyükurt. I'm a professor at John Molson School of Business in Business Technology Management, and I have been teaching modeling with data flow diagrams in my systems analysis course for quite a number of years. This is a follow-up to the Introduction to DFD Modeling video. I have this follow-up because after introducing my students to modeling with DFDs, and they start using it in their projects, they find out that there are certain topics that are quite challenging for them. So I asked them to let me know what it wasn't clear and then compile the questions and my answers to them. And I'd like to share that. One of the questions that I received, or the first question I received was, what's relevant? When you interview the clients, they give you a lot of information. When you read the case, there's some background information. What is to be included in the DFD and not included in the DFD? Well, let's think about the components of DFD. What are the components? It's either processes or data flows or data stores or external entities, right? Nothing else is there. So when you sort through the information given to you, if the information is either the process, data flow, or data store that is within the scope of the system, or it is an external entity that interacts with the system, then it is relevant. Any background information when you interview, for example, is not relevant, right? Anything that, for you to be able to decide on this, you need to be very aware of the scope. Whatever the scope defines to include the processes and all the data flows, data stores, any external entities associated with those selection of processes, that's relevant. So you need to identify which are outside the scope. If they interact with the system, then they are included. Or what happens within the scope, process or data that flows or data that is stored. I hope this clarifies it. Now, second, another question is, how do we decide which processes are linked together? Well, let's read the narrative. When customer order is received, first it is verified if it is an existing customer, then it is checked if the ordered products are in stock, and finally the bill is prepared. In all of these, the first, then, and finally, there is an immediacy. As soon as the process ends, the next thing starts. So let's look at this example. So here's a customer, sends an order to the system, right? The first thing that is done is to verify the customer. In order to verify the customer, there's a data store that you need to refer to get the customer data. So if it is verified, it will go on to the next one. But what if it's not verified? Well, then it will be the unverified, right? I'm not going into that right now. So if it is verified, now we have the order and the verified customer details. Not all the customers go through here. Not all the orders go through here. The next thing is immediately again, we check the product availability. We check it through products data store. We get the input. Now, if it's verified, it moves on to generating the bill. If it is not verified, so this is the unverified. I'm not going to go into that. What is important here is that there is the data flow coming from the customer goes to a process which immediately triggers another process, and when the second one ends, it immediately triggers the third one. So these are linked because of the wording used. Did it explicitly state immediately? It didn't. But this is an alternative way of saying it. It doesn't stop. The data didn't stop anywhere. That's the key. So there's a sequence of transformations. Instead of representing all of these transformations in one process, which would be overloaded, we separated them into 3 steps. Next. This one says, when the customer's order is received, it is stored temporarily until one of the staff has time to verify. This is an existing customer. Immediately after it, it is checked if the ordered products are in stock. So the customer sends the order, but it is stored temporarily, so we just receive the order. There is no process. If the processing of the data, no transformation. Because there is no transformation, these two have the same labels, right? And we update the received orders data store. When the second person, the person to verify, is available, this is time triggered, right? There is no process leading to it. When the time comes, it retrieves the data from the received orders data store, or copies it, doesn't delete it, right? And then it also refers to the customer's data store, which is exactly the same as the previous one, gets the customer details and does the verification, and this is the verified. What is missing, of course, is the unverified, and I'm not going into that, right? In order to check the product availability, we go to the products data store and get the product availability. So we see here that process 1 does not trigger process 2 because process 2 is time triggered, but process 2 does trigger process 3. All right. That's a lot of color, isn't it? Yeah. How do we distinguish between processes and their relationship? Their relationship is data flows, isn't it? Because if the relationship is with a data store or a external entity, it is a data flow that connects them with those. So processes involve a task. How do we know that? Because if you remember the syntax of a process, there's a label, right? And the label is an imperative phrase. An imperative phrase is a command. There is an active verb. That is the only component of a DFD model that actually indicates an activity, demands an activity. A data flow, on the other hand, the label is a noun phrase. There is no verb in it. There is no action that is possible. So what do you need to do then is you consider the label and the function associated with the information. If there is an action, then it's the process. If it's just data flowing, then it's a data flow. Another question is, what's the difference between processes and external entities? Now, when you interview your clients, sometimes you're going to talk about, these clients will tell you that something is done, but that whatever is done is outside the scope. It is not known. We don't know what is exactly the details are. For example, in a restaurant, what goes in the kitchen is a creative process. Kitchen in a restaurant. If that is outside the scope, then it is not within the system. It has to be an external entity. Or in a manufacturing company that manufactures t-shirts, the design of the t-shirt. That's a very creative process, isn't it? Or the production of the t-shirt. Now, in all of this, there is an external entity. For example, in this one, the cook or the kitchen team, or that actually provides the food, and then it is sent to the system. The system includes processes, data flows, and data stores, but not external entities, right? And the system in return may interact with the kitchen team. They're going to send the order and they're going to receive the filled order. The same is true with the design of the t-shirt. There will be a design team here. The system sends and receives. The production, again, that's the system that, do we want to really standardize that? Do we want to standardize the process in the cooking, the design of the t-shirt? These are creative processes in a way. They're challenging to standardize. They may be of no interest to the scope of the system. So you need to know the system enough and be familiar and aware of the scope at any point to make this decision. This question is discussed quite frequently. It's puzzling to students. Can a DS trigger a process? Well, look at this diagram. It looks like this is the trigger because there's a flow from the data store. There's a flow from the data store to the process, right? But it's not the data store that can actually do the triggering, because data stores cannot take actions. Their only function is to store data. There is no verb in the data store label. So basically, this is a time trigger. In some data flow conventions, This is represented by dotted line. I don't use it, but it is possible. Basically, what this means is when the time comes, the process retrieves the data from the data store and starts processing it. It is not the data store, it is the process that gets into motion because it's time. So it's time. Oops, sorry, not that. The time is trigger, is the trigger here. Next, I don't have a diagram to answer this question. Is a data store the same as a database? Well, a data store can represent a table in a database or the entire database. Most of the relational databases have multiple tables, right? It all depends on the relevance of the details of what data is stored in the database and how relevant it is to the system being analyzed. For example, take the ERP database. It has so many tables in it, right? Some of them could be about customers, others about suppliers, and so forth. What if the processing of the customer data is within the scope of the system? Then it will be represented as a data store. But for example, the suppliers might not be. Any interaction with the suppliers may not be within the scope of the system, then that will not be included in the model. Just keep in mind that in systems analysis, the emphasis is on the logical content. In other words, in this case, what is being stored rather than the physical aspect, that the data is stored in a large database or in a single table. Those are the physical aspects. Doesn't matter. What we're interested in is what data is stored that is within the scope. This question turns out to be quite puzzling for some students. Is it possible for a human entity within the system to be also modeled as an external entity? Well, we need to first remember that it's not the human entity itself that we're interested in, it's the role of the human entity that we're modeling. The human is the physical aspect of what a process might be done, might be performed by, or what an external entity is. Our interest is in the logical aspect. So let's say that a manager performs a task that is within the scope. So then we represent it as a process. So this is a manager performs a task that is within the scope. Within the scope of the system. If that is the case, it will be represented as a process. But, for example, the manager interacts with the client, receives the order, and so forth, which is within the scope. Let's say that manager also has a role of providing feedback, but that feedback is only the process of creating that feedback is outside the scope. In that case, we have the manager as an external entity. So in this case, what the manager does is outside the scope. Oops. In this case, what the manager does in other words, the role is outside the scope. So it's a matter of whether it is inside the scope or outside the scope. If it's inside the scope, it's a process. If it's outside the scope, it is an external entity. That's all for now. Thank you for watching and good luck in your studies.